Hi there, welcome to my YouTube channel Dhyani classes. If you are watching my video for the first time, do subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever new video will be uploaded. So in today's video, we will cover the second part of the chapter, The Rattrap, written by Salman Lagerlöf from class 12 CBSE. So let's get started. So in the first part of the chapter, we have seen that the old man who was the owner of this small cottage told the vagabond whole story, that how much money he had earned, and then in order to prove that, the old man stood up and went straight to the window, and there was a small leather bag which was hung on a nail in the window frame, and took out 30 kroner bills and showed him. And then both men went to the bed, and then in the morning both men woke up early in the morning, and then the old man went to the cow shed to milk his cow. And then the vagabond or the rat trap seller thought that he should not stay in bed anymore because the owner of the house had already woken up and it was early morning. So let's look at the second part of the chapter now. They left the cottage at the same time. So here he is saying that both men, the crofter or the owner of the house and the guest, woke up and then they left the cottage at the same time, and says the crofter locked the door and put the key in his pocket. So the crofter, that means the owner of the house, locked his house and put the key in his pocket and went to the cow shed to milk his cow because he had to sell the milk, and says the man with the rat trap said goodbye and thank you, and thereupon each went his own way. So he is talking about the rat trap seller here, that the rat trap seller said thank you and goodbye to the old man, and thereupon each went his own way. That means both the men went their own way, and then something had happened, and says, but half an hour later the rat trap paddler stood again before the door. So as they went their own way, but right after half an hour, the paddler stood again before the door. That means the rat trap seller came back right after half an hour and stood again in front of the house. Further he says he did not try to get in, however. That means the rat trap seller was standing in front of the door only, but he did not try to get inside the house because the old man had locked his door and put the key in his pocket, and says he only went up to the window, smashed a pan, stuck in his hand, and got hold of a pouch with the 30 kroner. So now we got to know that why this rat trap seller came back to the old man's house, because he was planning to steal the money which the old man had showed him, and then he only went up to the window, smashed a pan. That means he broke the panel of the window and stuck in his hand and got hold of the pouch with the 30 kroner. So what did he do? He just broke the window and put his hand inside the window and took out the pouch where the old man put his 30 kroner, and then he quickly put that money into his pocket very carefully and closed the window, and says he took the money and thrust it into his own pocket. So as soon as he closed the window very carefully, and he took all the money in his pocket very quickly, and says then he hung the leather pouch very carefully back in its place and went away. So he took out all the money, and then he put the empty pouch in its place, and very silently he ran away from the house. As he walked along with the money in his pocket, he felt quite pleased with his smartness. So here he is saying that as he walked along with the money in his pocket, that means as he was walking with the stolen money in his pocket from old man's house, he felt quite pleased with his smartness. So he became very happy because he was able to steal the old man's money very smartly or without noticing anyone, and used his intelligence on stealing the money, and says he realized, of course, that at first he dared not continue on the public highway but must turn off the road into the woods. So while walking, he realized, of course, that at first he dared not continue on the public highway. That means as he was walking, and suddenly he realized that he should not follow the public highway because he had a stolen money from old crafter's house, and there are chances that he may get caught, and says but must turn off the road into the woods. So he decided he should turn and take the road into the woods. That means instead of following the public highway, he should go through the forest because it was much convenient than the public highway. Further, he says during the first hour, this caused him no difficulty. So when he turned into the forest, the first hour of his way, he did not face any difficulties or challenges at all, and he was happy walking through the forest. Later in the day, it became worse, for it was a big and confusing forest which he had gotten into. So, as he was walking through the forest and as he kept walking towards the middle of the forest, then it was a big and confusing forest which he had gotten into. So, he started getting confused and he was facing difficulties in finding ways because the forest was becoming very dense and dark, and then he became quite frightened as well. Further, he says he tried to be sure to walk in a definite direction, but the path twisted back and forth so strangely. So later on, he tried to be sure. That means he tried very hard to find the right path, and says he was struggling to walk in a definite direction. That means he wanted to make sure the direction he was following should be correct or right, but on the other hand he could not find the right path, and says but the path twisted back and forth so strangely. So to his surprise, whatever path or direction he was following, it was twisted and turned in different directions, and he was not able to find out a particular direction to go because there was no definite path to follow. He walked and walked without coming to the end of the wood, and finally he realized that he had only been walking around in the same part of the forest. So here he is saying that he walked and walked without coming to the end of the forest. That means this rat trap seller had been walking continuously even without knowing in which direction he was walking, and then finally he realized that he had only been walking around the same part of the forest. So very soon he got to know that whatever efforts he was trying to make, it was useless, because he realized that he was walking around the same area of the forest and he was not moving further anymore. And says all at once he recalled his thoughts about the world and the rat trap. So when he understood that he is not moving further anymore, he remembered his thought about the world and the rat trap. So suddenly he remembered his thought about the world, that the whole world is a rat trap and people get trapped in it, and he understood that as per his thought that he himself also trapped into the rat trap called the world. Now his own turn had come. So now, just like others, how he was thinking for others, his own turn had come. That means he who had fallen into the rat trap, which is the world. Further, he says he had let himself be fooled by a bait and had been caught. So here the author is saying that he had let himself be fooled by a bait. That means he put himself into the trap of dense forest because of the baits. That means he had a 30 kroner bills which he had stolen from the crofter's house because he was attracted to it, and in order to escape from the public eye, he turned into the forest and then he had trapped inside the forest. So 30 kroner bills were the baits for him, and now he trapped inside the forest, and says the whole forest with its trunks and branches, its thickest and fallen logs, closed in upon him like an impenetrable prison from which he could never escape. So this man considering the forest as a rat trap because the forest was very dense and dark, and the whole forest was looking like a cage with its heavy trunks and branches and its thickest and fallen logs. That means broken branches and leaves fallen from the trees, and says closed in upon him like an impenetrable prison. That means he was surrounded by long trunks and broken branches, and it was looking like a prison in which he can't get out, and he thought he get caught and he will never be able to escape from this forest. So impenetrable means impossible to pass or enter. It was late in December, so it was the month of December, and he get caught in the dark and dense forest, and says darkness was already descending over the forest. So due to winter season, darkness was already descending. That means it was becoming darker, and it was the month of December, and says this increased the danger and increased also his gloom and despair. So as the darkness descending over the forest, this increased the danger. That means this man started feeling frightened and increased his gloom and despair. That means the forest was becoming darker and he was feeling very sad because he was all alone inside the forest and he was not able to find out the right direction to escape. Further he says, finally he saw no way out and he sank down on the ground, tired to death, thinking that his last moment had come. So later on, when the forest became dark, he saw no way out means he was not able to find out ways to escape and he sank down the ground, tired to death. So he was feeling very frightened as well. So he was so tired and sad on the ground and he felt that his death was near and says thinking that this last moment had come. That means he thought that he was about to die and the last moment had come, or he was sure that he is going to die. But just as he laid his head on the ground, he heard a sound, a hard regular thumping. So here, as he was frightened and tired, he laid his head on the ground. That means he laid down his head on the ground and suddenly he heard a noise, a hard regular thumping. That means he heard some kind of noise and it was a hard regular thumping. That means a regular hit or stroke on something, and says there was no doubt as to what that was. He raised himself. So as soon he heard that regular thumping, there was no doubt as to what that was. That means he got to know that he was nearby of something and there were people around, and then he gained some confidence and then he raised himself. That means he got up very slowly from the ground to see what was there. Those are the hammer stroke from an iron mill, he thought. So after hearing that regular thumping sound, he was sure that those are the hammer strokes from an iron mill. So he understood that there was an iron mill very near him and that regular thumping sound was coming from the heavy hammer stroke, and says there must be people nearby. So now he was certain that there were men working at the mill, and then he thought to move towards the direction in which the thumping sound was coming so that he can take help to come out from this dark and dense forest. Further he says he summoned all his strength, got up and staggered in the direction of the sound. So here he is saying that he summoned all his strength. That means he gathered all his strength and confidence and got up from there and staggered in the direction of the sound. So he started walking with great difficulties towards the direction in which he was hearing the sound, and says the Ramjo's iron works, which are now closed down, were not so long ago a large plant with smelter, rolling mills and forge. So here he was walking and he started thinking about the Ramjo iron works, which was now closed down. So earlier it was a huge plant making iron stuff and it had a large plant with a smelter, that means where metals are melted, and it had also a rolling mill and forge. So what do you mean by rolling mill? That means where these metals are drawn into the wires, and forge is the workshop of the blacksmith. So this factory called Ramjo Iron Works and had all these equipments were there together not very long ago. In the summertime, long lines of heavily loaded barges and scows slid down the canal. So here he is talking about the Ramjo Iron Works, that in the summertime, long lines of heavily loaded barges and scows. That means during summertime when the Ramjo Works was functioning, at that time heavily loaded barges and scows, that means narrow boats and flat bottom boats used to carry heavy loaded metals along the canal from the Ramjo Iron Works to another place, and says which led to a large inland lake. And in the winter time, the roads near the mill were black from all the coal dust which shifted down from the big charcoal crates. So as the big boats used to come through the canal and then through the large inland lake and then going away to deliver these metals things, and says in the winter time the roads near the mill were black from all the coal dust which shifted down from the big charcoal crates. So during this winter season, one can see the road near the mill full of dust and chemicals, and then dust used to sink on all the roads and turn into big charcoal crates. So during the winter season, man used to melt the waste iron materials using chemicals and other liquid stuff, and melting these things and rolling them and making the waste material into new one. Further, he says, during one of the long dark evenings just before Christmas, the master smith and his helper sat in the dark forge near the furnace waiting for the pig iron. So here the author is saying that during the long dark evening just before the Christmas, that means it was the month of December, and one fine dark winter evening just before the Christmas, the master smith and his helper sat in the dark forge, that means blacksmith who makes iron stuff, and he was sitting with his apprentice in his workstation near the hot furnace, and he was waiting for the pig iron, that means a small or large piece of iron. So he put a piece of iron inside the hot furnace and waited for it to be taken out so that they can work on it, and says, which had been put in the fire to be ready to put on the anvil. So as we know that blacksmiths put pieces of iron inside the furnace and they were waiting for it to be taken out so that they can put it on the anvil. That means after heating the iron, they will put that pig iron into a heavy iron block with a flat top, so that pig iron can be hammered or shaped. So in this way he is saying that they were waiting for the pig iron to be taken out of the fire. Every and now then one of them got up to stir the glowing mass with a long iron bar, returning in a few moments dripping with perspiration, though as the custom he wore nothing but a long shirt and a pair of wooden shoes. So here he is saying that now and then one of them got up to stir the glowing mass with a long iron bar. That means one after another they got up and go near the furnace to look the furnace, because they put pig iron inside the furnace, and says returning in a few moments. That means furnace was very hot and blazing because the temperature was very high. So they just go near the furnace and quickly return from near the furnace one by another, and says dripping with perspiration. That means they go near the furnace, they started feeling hot, and very soon they get wet with sweat because they would go near the furnace, and says, though as was the custom he wore nothing but a long shirt and a pair of wooden shoes. So they would wear long shirt and wooden shoes to prevent themselves from the fire. So that kind of dress they would be wearing whenever they go near the furnace. Further he says, all the time there were many sounds to be heard in the forge. So here he is saying that every time they could hear many different sounds coming from the forge because they were putting iron pieces into the furnace, and says the big bellows groaned and the burning coal cracked. So as they were hearing different kinds of sound from the forge, they were also hearing sound just like coming from the big bellows. So big bellows are huge kind of instrument that is used for blowing air so that they can burn fire more quickly, and coal also cracking with making different sound in the forge, and says the fire boy shoveled charcoal into a mouth of the furnace with a great deal of clatter. So there was a boy and he was sitting near the furnace and he was also shoveling charcoal into the mouth of furnace. That means he was throwing charcoal into the mouth of the furnace with a great deal of clatter. So as he was throwing charcoal into the furnace, and while throwing charcoal it was making very heavy sound. That means there was a lot of noise even when the charcoal was falling into the furnace. Outside roared the waterfall, and a sharp north wind whipped the rain against the brick tile roof. So here he is saying that outside roared the waterfall. That means there was a waterfall outside the forge, and sound was also coming from the waterfall. And a sharp north wind whipped the rain against the brick tiled roof. So as the water was falling down, the air was also blowing very heavily, and the sound pushed the water drops toward the brick tiled roof, which makes a lot of noise. So these were the different kinds of sound that were coming from the outside as well. Further he says it was probably on account of all the noise that the blacksmith did not notice that a man had opened the gate and entered the forge. So as there was a lot of sound coming from outside as well as from the furnace, due to these noise, the blacksmith did not notice that man hadn't opened the gate. That means he is talking about the Rattrap seller who entered inside the forge, and the blacksmith was not able to see or hear that somebody had opened the gate and entered inside the forge. So this Rattrap seller had identified the direction of the sound and walked to the forge, and says until he stood close up to the furnace. So when the Rattrap seller reached near the gate of the forge, he opened it and entered inside it and stood close up to the furnace. Surely it was nothing unusual for poor vagabonds without any better shelter for the night to be attracted to the forge by the glow of light which escaped through the sooty pans. So here he is saying that surely it was nothing unusual for poor vagabonds. That means it is not a new for the people who roam here and there without a home or shelter. So they used to go and take some rest inside the factory or the open building. And this vagabond also entered inside the forge because there was a glow of light that escaped through the sooty pan. So sooty pan means a window covered with a dust of charcoal. So there was a light inside the forge and the forge could be seen through the window because the light was coming outside from the window. So the light was visible to the most of the vagabonds and this attracted them and told them that they can have some shelter here. So this paddler followed the noise coming from the forge and reached there thinking that he would get some rest inside the forge for the night and says, and to come in to warm themselves in front of the fire. So when he entered inside the forge, the blacksmith and his helper working there, and then the vagabond came near the fire to warm himself because it was December and it was very cold outside and says, the blacksmith glanced only casually and indifferently at the intruder. So the blacksmith glanced only casually, that means the blacksmith looked at him very casually and indifferent at the intruder. So who's the intruder here? The vagabond, because he came inside the forge without any permission. Further he says he looked the way people of his type usually did, with a long beard, dirty ragged, with a bunch of rat traps dangling on his chest. So here the author is saying that he looked the way people of his type usually did. That means this vagabond reacting or looking in the same way as a beggar, and says he had a long beard, dirty ragged, with a bunch of rat trap dangling on his chest. So he had a long beard and he was wearing dirty ragged, that means dirty clothes, and he had a bunch of rat traps hanging on his chest because he was a rat trap seller, but now he was looking like a beggar. Further he says he asked permission to stay and the master blacksmith nodded a hearty consent without honoring him with a single word. So when he entered inside the forge and went straight to the furnace because he was feeling very cold, and then he asked permission to stay there, that means he asked the blacksmith to stay there for one night, and then the master blacksmith nodded a hearty consent without honoring him a single word. So the blacksmith just nodded his head by giving him permission to stay inside the Ramjo Iron Works without knowing who he was and from where he came and all. So he did not utter a single word and gave him the permission to stay there for the night. The tramp did not say anything either. So here the author is saying that tramp, that means a homeless man, did not say anything either. That means this rat trap seller did not speak anything at all because the blacksmith allowed him inside the mill, just nodding his head. So he did not say anything in return and says he had not come there to talk but only warm himself and sleep. So why this rat trap did not say anything in return? Because he had not come there to talk. That means he wanted to spend one night there in the mill and thought, why should I say anything in reply, because he came there for getting shelter and to sleep. So he kept quiet and sat near the furnace. Further he says in those days the Ramjo iron mill was owned by a very prominent iron master whose greatest ambition was to ship out good iron to the market. So here he is talking about the owner of the mill. In those days the iron mill was owned by a very prominent iron master. That means he was a very well known for business and in producing good quality iron stuff, and says whose greatest ambition was to ship good iron to the market. So this owner of the mill had the ambition to ship out, that means selling out the good quality iron to the market. Further he says he watched both night and day to see that the work was done as well as possible, and at this very moment he came into the forge on one of his nightly rounds of inspection. So here he is saying that he watched both nights and day to see that the work was done as well as possible. That means the owner of this iron mill used to come day and night to see work was done as well as possible. That means he used to come to check how the work is going on, and says at this very moment he came into the forge on one of his nightly round of inspection. That means when the iron master was inspecting each and everything, suddenly one fine night he came into the forge and it was his night round of inspection, and then he saw this vagabond near the furnace and says, Naturally, the first thing he saw was the tall ragamuffin who had eased his way too close to the furnace that steam rose from his wet rags. So here the owner of the mill describing how this paddler was looking like and saying he was a tall ragamuffin, that means a tall beggar or tall vagabond who had eased his way to so close to the furnace, that means he was sitting very near to the furnace and steam rose from his wet rags. So as we know that his clothes were so wet due to rainwater, so he sat near the furnace and due to heat steam was coming out from his clothes. The iron master did not follow the example of the blacksmiths who had hardly deigned to look at the stranger. So here the author is saying that the iron master did not follow the example of the blacksmiths. That means the owner of the mill did not ignore the Rattrap seller who was sitting near the furnace, and he wanted to know who the person he was and how he came inside the mill, and says who had hardly deigned to look at the stranger. So as the blacksmith completely ignored the person and just nodded his head and let him in without knowing anything about him, and even he did not bother to look at the stranger, but the iron master or the owner of the mill was very different kind of person, and then he walked close up to him, looked him over very carefully, then tore off his slouch hat to get a better view of his face. So the owner of the mill walked close up to that. That means the owner of the mill came closer to him near the furnace where this vagabond was sitting and looked at him very carefully. So the iron master started looking at him very attentively, and at that time this Rattrap seller was just lying near the furnace and he was covering his face with his slouch hat. That means round shaped hat. And then the iron master tore off his slouch hat to get a better view of his face. So the iron master pulled off his hat because he wanted to have a closer look at this paddler, and he saw his face, and then he became very surprised and amused and says, "But of course it's you, Nils Olof," he said, "how you do look." So the iron master took off his hat and became very surprised, and then he thought it was his old friend and his name was Nils Olof, and then he said, "How do you look?" So he was so surprised at the looks of the paddler and he said, "How do you look?" Further he says the man with the rat traps had never before seen the iron master at Ramjo and did not even know what his name was. So here the author is saying that the man with the rat trap had never before seen the iron master at Ramjo. That means this peddler never had seen the owner of the mill, and he met this man the very first time and says he did not even know what his name was. So the owner of the mill considering the paddler his old friend named Nils Olof, but at the same time the vagabond was not able to identify the iron master who was considering him his old friend. But we can say the iron master made a mistake in considering the paddler as his old friend and says, but it occurred to him that if the fine gentleman thought he was an old acquaintance, he might perhaps throw him a couple of kroner. So the paddler somehow became very happy and says it occurred to him that if the fine gentleman thought he was an old acquaintance, that means this vagabond thought it would be good for him if the owner of the mill considering him as his acquaintance, that means colleague or friend, and thought let him consider me as his old friend, so at least he would give me a couple of kroner. Further he says, therefore he did not want to undeceive him all at once. So here the author is saying that the paddler did not speak to him anything about who he was and from where he came, and says he did not want to undeceive him. That means the vagabond did not want to tell him the truth, that I am not your friend and you are making a mistake in considering me as your friend, and thought it would be great idea to keep quiet, and says, yes, God knows things have gone downhill with me, he said. So the peddler only say something to the iron master that things have gone downhill with me. That means things were so bad with me and he was facing many problems in his life, and that's why he was looking like this. So instead of telling the truth, the vagabond told him a lie, and then iron master says, you should not have resigned from the regiment, said the iron master. So here the iron master considering him one of the friend when he was in the army and told him you should not have resigned from the regiment. That means you should not be resigned from the army or from the regiment, and says that was the mistake. So he told him that he made a mistake or he made a big mistake when you were in army and he should not have done this, and says If only I had still been in the service at that time, it never would have happened. So the iron master told the peddler that, thinking he was in his friend, and he told him that if I was there at that time when you were resigning, I wouldn't have allowed you to leave or resign from the regiment. I hope you liked the video. Let's look at the third part of the chapter in my next video. For more informative videos, do subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever new video will be uploaded. So thank you so much for watching once again. Stay safe, stay healthy.